What is it?
The main thing I got from it was like this sense of feeling seen and validated.
Well, why does it have to be this way?
This book was placed in my hand for this moment.
Insightful, learned a lot, wrote some quotes that I'm ready to like paint on my wall.
I love this book!
That we just kind of pull out some of the big themes that we see and talk about a few different ones.
I apologize if most of my contribution has K-pop references.
Alternative book title, The Feminine Mystique Part 2. You were really just gay all along. Welcome to Book Club.
With Julia!
And Victoria.
Those people at the back of the theater who are like, the book was better!
And we'd like to be your book friends. This is a podcast for the books we just can't shut up about.
And this week, we are reading The Stone Sky by N.K. Jemisin.
It's happening!
It's finally happening! This is the third and final book in the Broken Earth adult fantasy trilogy.
And if you have not read The Stone Sky, you are welcome here, but please know there are major spoilers ahead.
For the whole series.
Everything and anything in the entire series. So, this is your official warning. Thanks for joining. Okay.
If you're still here, you have consented to having things spoiled for you. And we're really happy to have you. If you'd like to support the show, you can rate, review, and subscribe on any and all podcast platforms, including now on Spotify. You can leave little comments underneath our episodes. So recommend us a book.
How fun.
In the show notes, if there are any book links, they will link to our affiliate page on bookshop.org, where if you buy a book from that page, any book, we get a very small kickback. And finally, if you'd like to become a member, if you want to join the club and get all the exclusive things and talk to us directly, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/bookclubwithjv and join for as little as $3 a month. We're currently saving up for a transcription project so that we can make all of our old episodes more accessible. And the most recent thing that we have released for members is our review of the first 5 episodes of Daisy Jones and the Six, the series, an adaptation of the book. And the final 5 is coming. It's been really fun. We have a lot of thoughts about this one. So come hang out, come join us. We'd love to see you there. So who the heck is N.K. Jemisin? We've talked about her a few times already.
Yes, so Nora K. Jemisin is an American author, best known for her sci-fi and fantasy writing. She received hella awards for all the things, including Hugo Awards for each installment of this trilogy, the Broken Earth trilogy. This has not been a thing that was ever done before, for all 3 books of a trilogy to win the Hugo, which is basically the best sci-fi fantasy book of the year. This is the final installment, like we talked about. The Stone Sky was published in 2017. These are a few things that are probably highlights from the last 2 times that we've talked about Jemisin as a person and as an author. A few things to know. One is that Jemisin previously was a psychologist, and she worked full-time as a counselor while she was writing for many years. She didn't quit her day job until after the 5th season's rousing success. She launched a crowdfunding campaign that enabled her to get enough income to quit her day job and write full-time. I was really hoping to have an update here, but I don't have any other news that they've made public. A movie adaptation is in the works for the Broken Earth trilogy. I don't know if it's going to be 3 movies or 1. What we do know is Sony's TriStar Picture is the ones who got the rights for it. Jemisin is adapting the series herself. And Michael B. Jordan is on board to produce with his production company, Outlier Society. But that's all we know. So I'm hoping. Because Michael B. Jordan announced as producer in 2021. Curious to see if we get any updates this year, if they get a green light to start casting and whatnot. But a new fun fact, this one is really just for Julia, but it's for anyone else who's listening too, I guess. I found an interview with N.K. Jemisin and Crunchyroll, which if you're not familiar with Crunchyroll is the big anime streaming service. But in 2000, I almost said 2000. In 2000, So 23 years ago, Jemisin co-founded and ran, I might be pronouncing this wrong, SojuCon, which was self-described as the first and only convention in the world for fans of shoujo manga and anime, which is sometimes referred to as like girls manga and anime.
Oh my god.
Yeah, like
this is blowing my
mind. The whole
mind.
interview was so fun, like her describing this experience. It was like her and some friends got together and they were like, we're going to do this thing. Her and a friend co-founded it so that no one would have to do like shoulder all the work, and then they had like a big group of volunteers that were like super gung-ho about it. To raise funds, a bunch of people donated like manga and merch and all this other stuff. This is like early days of the internet.
Yeah.
And so it was like very analog. But people were like sending her stuff in the mail that she then sold on eBay, because eBay did exist at the time, and that's how they like funded the first year.
Wow.
This is a quote from the article. Jemisin said, "Looking at the media landscape and English-speaking fandom today, and all the stuff that's now readily accessible at places like Crunchyroll, I think we did it. Companies took notice of Soju Con's growth and success while it lasted, and the fact that we were getting good guests. Other cons took notice of some of our innovations, and people started asking for Soju tracks at those cons. Anyway, I will 100% toot our own horn and say I think Soju Con was the start of a sea change in which people finally realized anime and manga were for everyone. Achievement unlocked."
Wow. So she's like a proper nerd.
She's a proper nerd, yeah.
I am so impressed and awe-inspired. What a person.
So those are my author notes for today. If you're like, Victoria, what does this have to do with the book we're reading today? It doesn't. Go back and listen to our other episodes where I have a more formal presentation of who our author is and how it relates to the book. But today, that's what I have.
I enjoyed it. So
thank you. I mean, I'm really here just to like entertain you and hopefully get a few like shock and surprise moments every couple episodes. If you haven't read my notes in advance.
Honestly, I try not to read them because I'm always thrilled every time she finds some new fun fact. And you know I love a fun fact.
So let's summarize for our listeners who maybe it's been a bit since they read the book. What happens in book 3 of this trilogy?
As a refresher, this story takes place on a landmass called the Stillness, which is constantly rocked by earthquakes and volcanic activity. And the present day of the story is during a 5th season, which is a time of like cataclysmic seismic activity. There's ash in the sky. This particular season was caused by an origin named Alabaster, who broke the continent in half for various reasons. But the fact that the seasons happen was caused by the moon being flung out of orbit thousands of years ago, and the Earth is angry. So now the two strongest origins, Esun and her daughter Nasun, have both been charged with harnessing the moon as it comes back into orbit for different purposes. But in general, everyone is trying to resolve the war between the angry Earth and like all of humanity, while also dealing with like systemic oppression against their kind and surviving a season and minor human squabbles of family and community. So this book, we start in moments or days with Esun kind of in a coma from all the magic she did to destroy the attacking army, and has, as a result, kind of destroyed the underground community that they were living in, but all the people got out. And Nasun is in the Antarctic. She's standing over the crystallized body of her father, and she's been caught in the act of killing him. So Nasun and Shafa, her guardian, who has been sort of reformed, he was the villain of book 1, and now he's like reformed and it's complicated, we have feelings. The two of them kill all the witnesses, and they take all the other origin children, they flee the scene, and then the two of them go in search of a place where Nasun can sort of harness the power of the obelisks and the moon. So they end up traveling through the center of the planet, and they witness how alive and angry the Earth is, and it is so terrifying. And we also learn how Shafa, as a guardian, has this little piece of metal on the back of his neck that's a part of the Earth's core. And he's sort of, the Earth uses it to control him. He's kind of a slave to the Earth's will, and he's been fighting it. When Esun wakes up, parallel storyline, her comm is on the move to a place where they have a better chance of surviving the season, and she is slowly turning to stone from all the magic she did. So she has to learn how to be a part of this community again and survive really harsh conditions and cope with the fact that she has broken her daughter's trust, perhaps forever. She and her Stone Eater companion Hoa, they're on the side of like trying to realign the moon with the Earth in order to establish a truce and end the current season. And the third storyline, which I didn't even write in here, that we're also getting is Hoa's backstory. Basically the final days before the moon got exploded, establishing who all the different factions are and how this whole mess started. So at the very end, Esun and Nasun have a kind of final showdown where they're both harnessing tons of power, trying to do opposite things, right? So Nasun's trying to destroy everything, and Esun's trying to fix it. And they're both slowly turning to stone. But in the end, Esun lets go because she doesn't want to see her last surviving child die. And so Nasun, upon seeing her mother die, as a result of her own actions, decides to follow her mother's intentions instead and puts the moon back in place. Which I imagine this scene would just be the two of them just like standing there.
Yeah. It's described in such like angst and detail about like what they're doing on this like seismic level, and they're like in the obelisks and they're harnessing them. But yeah, for like Tonki that's like standing nearby, it's probably just the two of them like frozen, like holding their hands out, like
frozen in very serious poses,
thinking really hard.
Yeah, like staring at each other very seriously.
Yeah. The most dramatic thing is when like Essen's body is like turning more and more into stone as she's like climbing up the stairs.
Oh my god, that moment was...
But yeah, otherwise the moon is just like still there. Like that's the point, is the moon got so close and then they got it back in orbit, but like they didn't know it actually worked until they just like tracked the moon for a long time. They're like, okay, it hasn't left us. I guess it's still here.
Yeah, I guess it's still here. So then at the very, very end, we learn that Asun becomes a stone eater and that Hoa has been narrating this whole book series to her in order to remind her of who she is and why she is where she is. As the magic that creates her is sort of realigning, I guess. I feel like that summary is sort of a great demonstration of like how complicated these books are. Like they're really not for the faint of heart. Like they're adult. Sure, there's like sexual content, but like, and there's some cursing, but like they're really adult in the sense that you have to like know how like science and language work, and you have to like think really hard about stuff. So what was you read it first and then you recently reread it. So you've had kind of 2 times around. So what has been your experience?
So the first time I read this, it was pretty close after when we recorded the Obelisk Gate episode. I was like riding the high of just finishing book 2. I was like, I want to read book 3. Here we go. And I remember when I read it, telling my partner, like, I feel like I'm just reading to get to the end and figure it all out. Mm-hmm. I wasn't like actively enjoying it while I was reading it. It wasn't a slow read. Like, I think I read it over a matter of days. But the second time was way more enjoyable because I like knew what was going on. And so I wasn't like thinking so hard. I was just like, oh, I didn't notice this the first time. I'm like, oh, I remember this being confusing, but now I know what's happening. And like, now I know what's, you know, how these things are unfolding. And I caught more of the details and more of kind of the world building of like how, especially this ancient civilization, the
Sil'anagist is how the audiobook reader pronounces it.
This is how we should do most books, is you listen to it so I can be like, what are these words? And then you know how they're pronounced.
Yeah.
The Sil'anagist. It was just like much more exciting, and I caught more of the details of their civilization because I kind of knew where the broad strokes was going, and also forgot so much of this book. I really remembered like where we ended, but yeah, when I sat down to reread, I was like, I kind of forgot where we started. Like I forgot this picks up right after book 2. And yeah, overall it was enjoyable. I thought it was a really strong conclusion to the trilogy. I think I don't know Jemisin's writing approach, but it like, seems impossible to me that she wrote the first book not knowing the third book, because it all wraps up. There's like some unknowns, things that you and I can talk about in this episode, but really it doesn't leave any like gaping loose ends or gaping like discrepancies of how this could have worked out the way it did. Some of it, you know, you're building up to this final showdown, and as you and I talked while you were reading it, you were like kind of could anticipate some of the broad strokes that were going to happen, but it didn't feel like I sat down before book 3 and knew exactly how this had to end. You know, like there was still a lot like left open. And I think this one also just started answering a lot of those questions that we had at the end of book 2.
Yeah. That was it for me. Like I kind of knew in terms of plot where we had to end up. I was like, we're getting Hoa's perspective and his chapters count down. So I'm like, oh, okay, we're counting down to the explosion. And then the end has to be the moon wrangling, because like that's kind of what we're building towards. I kind of knew like, okay, that's where the climax of the book is going to be, but I had no idea how we were going to get there and how it was going to ultimately resolve, though I kind of figured out. It becomes clear pretty quickly, like, oh, I think Essun's going to become a stone eater because Alabaster did, and Hoa's like in love with her, and it just seems like it kind of, I don't know. After he eats her boob, I was like, I think that's where we're going. It was such a weird moment. He like pops it off like a can lid. It's like so crazy. But so for me, what kept me reading was getting all the questions answered. So if you listen to our Obelisk Gate episode, I had so many things that I was struggling to piece together because there's so many different sides to the story than you originally think. You think it's just like the people in power and the oppressed people, and there's like 12 more that you didn't know about. And we get hints of them in book 2, but this one is when finally we get everything woven together. And so a lot of Victoria and I's conversation yesterday was, I was like, okay, so how are these things connected? And how is this connected? Because I just needed it all to make sense. So that's really what propelled me forward. And I feel like it was much more engaging than book 2. Book 2 is by far my least favorite, but probably not as much as book 1, somewhere in the middle. But I had to take like constant notes while I was listening and do some kind of like, I need to be cooking or doing some like mindless tasks in order to kind of keep my brain focused on the story, because you really have to pay attention. I feel like what makes this whole series challenging is that it moves slowly because there's a lot of words and she has to describe it takes a lot of words to explain what's happening inside someone's mind. So there's not a lot of action at any given point. And there are tons of these highly technical details that you need to learn that you're always learning. And then there's a ton of description of things that you feel like you should recognize, because she doesn't just like hand everything to you. So sometimes you have to like recognize things from earlier in the series or from real life, or you have to make connections based on something someone else has said in order to know what's going on in front of you. You're constantly translating everything she's describing because the characters themselves might not know what they're seeing. And sometimes Hoa, the narrator, will explain, and sometimes he won't. And so you have to piece together from their descriptions what's really going on, what you're really seeing. And like really complicated futuristic science as well, that you're like trying to figure out how magic works. It's a lot. And so I have to sit there and listen to these like paragraph long, passage long, highly technical descriptions. And like so many of my notes are me like parsing through what we've learned so far, trying to put the pieces together. And so it can be really taxing, but it's emotionally very resonant, and I think getting the questions answered is really satisfying. And like, I just love, she includes so many little world building details that like she did not have to include that just make me really love it. Like, to give you a sense of how old the Stone Eaters are, one of them has a pet whale or whatever, some kind of whale adjacent. And I lost my mind. I loved it so much. I was like, he has a pet whale! And it's just so cute. And and the whale's like super old and kind of battered, and you're like, wow, they've been friends for like a super long time. Also the fact that like Alabaster's ex-boyfriend is like the one compiling all the stone lore and all the quotes we get at the end of the chapters. There was like a through line in that story from all these 3 books that she did not have to put in there. But it was just such a fun little thing from Alabaster. We get more about how he was radicalized and about his emotional story. It just feels so fun to have that kind of light bulb moment of like, oh, all of these things are connected and they're coming from this person who's like relevant to the story. So there's a lot of stuff like that. And I really, really liked the kind of humanization of Hoa and the Stone Eaters in general by getting their backstory. But Hoa in particular, because you get his emotions. Like, he's bitchy, and I was obsessed. I was obsessed with, he's so passive aggressive.
Yeah, he's great.
I loved him so much. Anyway, so clearly I had a lot of thoughts.
And we'll get into more of those thoughts. To start off our discussion, we'll revisit some of those questions we had from the Obelisk Gate, the second book. The first being like, whose side is everyone on? How many sides of this conflict are there? And we do kind of get more clarity in this book. I particularly appreciated how complex the conflict was. It's not a cut and dry good versus evil. It's not even like the slightly heightened, like, sympathetic villain that we get in a lot of, you know, when you're like, oh, we root for the good guy, but we have sympathy for the evil side. This is, like, I think maybe much more, like, resonant of real life, you know, that people have, like, a lot of different motivations. They join different factions because they maybe get to the same end goal, but they have different reasons for doing it. But wow, yeah, it does require you to be quite the active reader like you were describing. So, in summary, we have, I'm going from, like, oldest to youngest is my order here. So the oldest is the Earth. The Earth is alive. If we had hints and ideas that Father Earth was truly animate in the first books, it is confirmed in the third book. And we learn more fully how the Guardians are his puppets. The Earth is really the one in charge and is actually quite terrifying. Oh my gosh, the little bits where the Earth speaks to Hoa and the tuners, and then also when he speaks to Nasun and says, like, hello little enemy, it's like, oh, it's so creepy and so terrifying.
The way the audiobook reader read it too, oh, chills down my spine. So
we learn in book 3 that the Stone Eaters were created because of this initial, like, conflict, or they were the initial instigators of this conflict. The Stone Eaters were, when they were created, called, like, tuners. And we learned they were kind of, like, genetically modified to be able to control and tune the obelisks to create this plutonic engine that would eventually be, like, this, like, way to tap into the Earth's core and use all of the magic in the Earth's core to power the civilization. And the tuners are radicalized by Kalenli, who is the kind of the prototype, the first tuner that was created that had more human characteristics than Hoa and the other tuners did. And they end up pushing back. So instead of charging up the engine to run as their oppressors had hoped, they try to turn it back on itself to blow up the civilization. And they're, like, willing to die and sacrifice for this cause. But this is the initial battle, the very first battle of the war, where the Earth fights back. Because the Earth doesn't recognize different factions of humans. It's just like, the humans are fucking with me and I'm not okay with it. Then the end of that first battle is the tuners being turned to Stone Eaters who live for freaking ever. They don't die.
Yeah.
And then that's when the moon gets flung away, is, like, kind of the casualty of that war. There is great disruption that destroys the planet, but not completely, so humanity still survives. So anyways, so now we have the Earth and the Guardians. The Guardians have his puppets, the Stone Eaters, they've been around for a long time. But the Stone Eaters have different opinions, because they've been around for fucking ever, and they've observed a lot of things. And so there's the ones that want to destroy everything, for many reasons. Maybe they want to end suffering for everyone. They want to end their endless existence. They're over it. And so that's the Stone Eaters that recruit Nasun. And then there's the ones like Hoa who want to resolve the conflict. They want to fix the moon, bring it back, end the seasons. But they want to appease Father Earth to preserve humanity as a species. Preserve life on Earth.
The thing that I think I was stuck on, so this is my last lingering question, is because it's sort of suggested to us in previous books that the old Sanzid families in Numinous are the ones who think they're in charge and are using the Guardians to sort of control origins and maintain their power in their city, but that it's actually the Guardians who are in charge.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was trying to figure out this whole time, like, who was in charge of the Guardians. Like, I knew from pretty early on they had a little piece of the Earth in their neck, and the Earth is, like, in their head and controlling them. But I thought a person, a particular faction of Stone Eaters or people or something, would be the ones in charge of that. Because I'm like, who built all the stuff and who did all the things? So is the book suggesting that when the sort of core sample that they've taken from the center of the Earth explodes, when Father Earth fights back, this is way back in Sil Anagist, they've taken a little piece of the core, they put it in this little glass case, or whatever, and it explodes.
Oh my gosh, I didn't think about this. I see where you're going.
And Hoa talks about, he's assuming this is what happened, that the shards, like, I thought he was saying that they killed everyone.
Same.
But is he saying that the shards entered the people and then controlled the people in order to create all the infrastructure and create the Guardians? Like, the first Guardians were those sort of people in the control room who were in charge of the tuners.
I think you're right. I think you're spot on. I didn't catch that either. I thought they also died.
Because I was like, where the fuck did they come from? And how did they build? Because we go into Warrant, and there's all this really fancy technology, but Nasun sees that it was made really fast. And I'm like, so whose idea was it? You know what I mean? Like, who? So it was the Earth's idea, and he was controlling these puppets, and then the puppets did the stuff, and sort of that started the cycle of creating these systems of the Guardians and doing what the Earth wanted them to do. Is that...
I think that's right.
Because that's crazy.
Yeah, it's wild. Because, I mean, we also get hints of this, right? We get hints of it. When Hoa is telling the story of... He's, like, thinking back, and there's all this reference to, like, memory is hard for him because he's so old, but as he starts remembering, more of it comes back. But there's moments where he compares certain people in the past to people in the present, and he will say, like, they don't actually look the same, but, like, it reminds me of them. If you see the similarities too, like, that's okay. Gallant looks like Shafa.
Yes. And I thought they were the same person at first when I first saw him.
Yeah, until we get the idea that Shafo is not the oldest. He wasn't like the first gen Guardian. He was like created later. But that's why Ho kind of like puts this like commonality. I think that's also how Jemisin creates these connections in our mind to help us understand. Like, as soon as an origin is like a super late descendant of Kalenli as a tuner. And the same way that Shafa as a guardian is a descendant of the guardians that were created from that explosion, including Gallant. Also terrifying that those were because there's oh my gosh, there's a moment. Let me grab my copy.
We're having an epiphany here, folks.
I love an on mic epiphany. Like, this is not in our notes.
No.
This is exciting. This is like okay. So when Ho is explaining what happened at the end of this explosion, he screamed as wave upon wave of alchemy worked over him, quote, changing my flesh into raw, living, solidified magic that looked like stone. So that's him being turned into a stone eater. Next paragraph. We didn't get the worst of it. That was reserved for those who had offended the earth the most. It used the core stone fragments to take direct control of these most dangerous vermin. But this did not work as it intended. Human will is harder to anticipate than human flesh. They were never meant to continue.
Oh.
I mean, she like plainly says it right there, but
Okay.
I didn't catch it until you started talking about it. I even highlighted it and I didn't quite get it. Maybe I highlighted it because I didn't understand it. But like what he's referring to is that like the Earth creates the Guardians, but the Earth only had so much control of them to begin with. And we see this even back in book 1 when we have a Guardian who is kind of slipping up. You know, their will is coming through, and that's when Shafa takes the core stone out of their head, and she dies on the table. And this is what we get Shafa's kind of like rebellion, is being able to hold out and claim his humanity and his will against the control of the earth. Fascinating stuff.
Yeah, because Shafa and the Guardians are so complicated because they're so terrible. They're so terrible. And they're like manipulating all human decisions and stuff as an institution. And yet, as individuals, they are taken as children. They're basically like squibs. Not to quote she who must not be named, but I feel like it's an apt comparison where it's like people who are born to magical families and should have those genes. They're perceptive of magic, but they can't use it. And they get this really manipulative, really painful piece of stone put in their neck. And they live for thousands of years.
Yeah, I mean, Shafa was noted as like one of the oldest, and he, I think, was like 10,000.
And he survives because he thinks he's doing something good, because he genuinely believes that, because he genuinely loves his charges, and he thinks that controlling and oppressing them is better than genocide. That's what he thinks his options are. Because that's what the Earth has presented to them, basically. Like, they are the villains, and yet you can understand how they are victims. Like, this book, I'm much more sympathetic to Shafa. I remember I had a really hard time last book with him being a sympathetic character. I hated it. I fought every step of the way. Every goddamn second. I was like, no! I will not like this man. And this book, I was like, all right, I see it. But you also understand the Earth, too, because it's not the Earth's fault. It was attacked very stupidly by people who are very stupid and thought too much of themselves. And then just fought back. And because the Earth is a planet, its sense of time and its sense of, like, who is too massive to comprehend the little nuances that make up human life, you know? And it's like, yeah, the only bad guys, like, if you want to place blame anywhere, it's, like, on the ideology at the heart of the Sil-Anagist imperial structure. Mm-hmm. And, like, the fundamental beliefs that they had, which we'll get into in a second, about how certain things were not alive and certain things were, and that they got to decide. That's the enemy. It's not nearly as satisfying as, like, because you want the Guardians to be controlled by some sort of big bad evil villain. And then you meet the Earth, who, again, fucking terrifying, but not really a villain.
Yeah, like someone drilled a hole through him and flung his sun, the moon, away, and, like,
was trying to steal all his energy, and yeah.
Wild. I think one of the things that was so mind-boggling for me in this, and has been, like, a constant thing I have to come back to as we've been preparing for this episode, is that it's been 40,000 years.
Oh my god.
Between the storyline of Hoa as a tuner and Esun and Asun. 40,000 years. I was, like, doing some research, like, what was happening on planet Earth 40,000 years ago? This would be...
Were there people?
Yes. Homo sapiens lived, it was the upper Paleolithic era, or the late Stone Age. The earliest petroglyphs that we have, so that's, like, the paintings on rocks or whatever, are from 40,000 years ago. The earliest petroglyphs we have.
Wow.
So if we think back to the upper Paleolithic era and how little we know of that civilization...
Yeah.
It's literally just, like, etchings on a wall is about all we have, and some, like, archaeological artifacts of, like, bones and shit.
We have some really old grain.
We're not talking about ancient Egypt. We're not talking about ancient Babylon. We're talking, like, so old that we don't know the name of these civilizations. That's the span of time we're talking about here. And so we get some really incredible things that Jemisin is doing, right? So we have, like, continental shift. During the Sil-Anagist period, there was 3 land masses. In the current day of the book, there is 1. They've been kind of fused together. We get, like, details about linguistic drift. So, like, one of the...
That was fun.
That was really fun. One of the moments when you realize how old Shafa is when he has enough language ability to understand the language of this ancient Sil-Anagist pod thing that travels through the middle of the earth. And you're like, holy cow. Yeah. And so there's also just then 40,000 years that we don't know. You know, we've got these broad strokes from Hoa of, like, this is what happened to set off the war. And we get these interludes and little bits of history and research from this in between the chapters, you know, that kind of allude to what's happening. In the back, we get an anthology of all the seasons. But even all the seasons, that's only accounting for the last few thousand years.
Right.
Of the stillness.
It's so hard to even comprehend I think something that I struggled with was, like, when we were getting backstory and when we were getting details, I was trying to draw these kind of one-to-one connections. And 40,000 years, like, there are no one-to-one connections. You know what I mean? Because I was trying to piece together, like, oh, how has the same system of oppression continued? Roughly. After all this time, it has to be the same group of people. It has to be, but no, it's just kind of an idea. It's just the same idea, and, like, the Earth has been there the whole time, and the Stone Eaters have been there the whole time, so, like, the Guardians have been there the whole time, I guess. But this particular system of oppressing the Origins is fairly recent in comparison, because I remember we got that one story about, like, the foundation of Sanzid or whatever, that's only maybe 1,000 years old, and it gives the impression that that Origins were not always oppressed the way they are now. So it's, like, it's so hard to even comprehend something that big. Because there's such a big gap, she doesn't quite walk us through exactly how we get there. I was trying to make those one-to-one connections, and I had to sort of give that up. That was the main thing I had to learn. It was like, oh, I have to understand that it's not all exactly this one big conspiracy necessarily. Like, the smaller human political squabbles are just people being people, and it doesn't tie up in a bow quite so nicely. And something that we wrestled with together, because, again, the book does not answer this question, was that Orogeny seems to have evolved out of necessity from magic to the point where they don't even know what magic's called anymore. They don't know that that's the source of that power. They don't know that every living thing has magic, has this magical energy in it, and that you're connecting to everything. Because out of necessity, when the earth is sort of shaking constantly, and you need to be able to survive, the only magical skill you need is to be in tune to the earth and to be able to, like, control it. Because something you pointed out was, like, the way that the tuners were genetically designed, they needed to be able to communicate with the gemstones through magic. And they were pulling from the magic of the earth in order to build them. And so sort of as a consequence, they could speak and they were very in tune with the earth in particular. That particular type of magic was very natural for them, and they could speak through the earth with each other. They called it earth speak. But they couldn't move the earth. They couldn't, like, they weren't like moving mountains, and that wasn't something that they thought they needed to do. But it would make sense that Kalenli's descendants over time, who were more in tune with the earth and knew about magic, that it could evolve into orogeny. But why the two don't like each other, I think, is maybe a matter of, like, method or relationship or something.
I think it comes down to, like, skill and understanding. Like, if origins understand themselves in the context of their world, why would they assume there was another way? You know, like, they understand themselves within what they're told about what orogeny is. And I mean, this is something Asun battles with a lot in, like, the second book, is realizing that her Fulcrum training, you know, she was focused on being able to move a pebble. And, like, why would you need to move a pebble? Like, right. You know, the feral, quote unquote feral, origins like Yika have a different kind of precision, you know, a different kind of, like, attune to what they need to be able to do. One thing that was interesting to me as well is this idea that not only were Kalenli's descendants the ones who had these kind of, like, altered Sesapine, and they were able to procreate with non-modified humans so that they, you know, continue to breed, and then now we have what are the origins 40,000 years later. But this was also the start of, like, the Lorist tradition.
Yeah.
Kalenli has understood the Nis, which are a formerly oppressed population that horribly oppressed, to create the Silangist plutonic engine that have been pretty much decimated through genocide. But she kind of learns about the Nis Loris tradition, and she kind of, like, upkeeps it as, like, her own tribute to, like, where she came from in a way, even though, like, she wasn't Nis, but she was created in the image of Nis. And yeah, so we get this, like, quote towards the end of the book where only Kalenli's children who did not stand out, whose strength hid in plain sight, continued. Only Kalenli's legacy in the form of the Loris who went from settlement to settlement, warning of the coming Holocaust and teaching others how to cooperate, adapt, and remember remains of the Nis. I thought that was a kind of cool through line and connection too, because we get the Loris from the very beginning. Remember? Nasun wants to be a Lorist when she grows up. So she's, like, skips school to go hang out with the Lorist in town. And at the end, we learn that her heritage is kind of in both traditions. So yeah, that evolution piece, I feel like it does take a little bit of a mental jump. You could either just, okay, I think it's either way. Either you can just read it, take it face value, and be like, yeah, Kalenli's descendants become origins, cool. Or you can be like us and be like, but how? How did it work? And, like, overthink it. But I think a lot can be brushed away with, like, 40,000 years of, like, oh, like, the origins that were able to tap into the earth and still things lived long enough to reproduce and create more origins who had more attunement to the earth, and they didn't need an, like, remember in book 1 when it's like people never even looked at the obelisks, they were just there,
right?
And it's a huge deal when younger Essen, like, reaches up and, like, connects to an obelisk.
Oh my god, I had a question about that.
Yeah,
because there was a person inside that obelisk.
Mm-hmm.
The broken one that she finds?
It was Hoa.
Hoa's inside of it?
Yeah.
Why is he inside of it? Because that's not how they're designed. The obelisks are not designed because when I originally read that, I was like, oh, these are all little capsules for little stone people. But no, the obelisks are sort of the spiritual energy of this decimated people. Sort of. So they do have feelings. So why was Hoa inside of it?
I think, okay, what I remember and what I just looked up real quick on, like, a fan wiki is to paraphrase, he just like had a run-in with the wrong origin. It seems like there's like some, like he's been around for so long. At one point, he ran in with the wrong origin and got thrown up there and stuck for a very long time. I think that also kind of gives us like an instigation of why Hoa was interested in cyanide, because she saves him from eternal fossildom.
Fossildom.
I just imagine him like those like insects they find in amber.
Yeah, basically, yeah. I feel like the two biggest things that we're left with then, so we have all these questions answered, and then we're sort of left with, at least what the main things I feel like Jemisin is sort of handing to us, is the ways that oppression works on all these different levels and how persistent it is. And then she sort of is also painting a picture of potentially how to move forward and work our way out of that. Something that really hit me as soon as I learned that Steel, or the Gray Man, is 40,000 years old, it sort of just sunk in my stomach like a pile of bricks. That, like, just this feeling of, like, how... Because I feel like the structures in our world that we are clamoring against are a couple hundred years old, And they feel so big and so pervasive. They're just everywhere. How do you deal with 40,000 years of oppression and conflict? Like, how do you cope with that legacy? It just felt so massive and insurmountable. And it really hit home for me, like, okay, this is what this book series is about. Is Jemisin's trying to teach us about how oppression works. We'll get to, I think, where she sort of leaves us in her suggestions, but you pulled up a bunch of her sort of thoughts on oppression I thought were interesting.
Yeah, so, we have this quote from the book itself. Some worlds are built on a fault line of pain held up by nightmares. Don't lament when those worlds fall. Rage that they were built doomed in the first place. And this to me kind of feels like a bit of, like a core tenet of this series is watching these civilizations fall. And while we're sympathizing with the pain and the suffering of the individuals in the moment who are going through the fifth season, we are eventually led to be on the side of just raging that it was built this way in the first place, right? I think one review of the book, it was published by NPR. It was written by author Amal El-Mohtar. You might remember her as one of the authors of This Is How You Lose the Time War. She pointed out this subversive aspect of Jemisin's writing that I was like, duh, of course. Like, I just hadn't put the words to it. El-Mohtar writes, I'm used to fantasy and science fiction and novels and films and comic books, setting up apocalypse as threat, cataclysmic, change as something to be prevented at all cost. Villains are, by and large, those who want to change the world, while heroes are the ones who preserve the status quo, who keep it intact. The unquestionable premise of this kind of setup is that the world is precious and worth saving. The Stone Sky rejects this out of hand. The book interrogates what right worlds built on oppression and genocide have to exist. Yeah, it felt like a big, like, aha, but also oh duh moment of, like, why this book felt so different, like, what it was doing. It was very much like, let's blow up the world, and at times you're like, Alabaster, why the fuck did you do that? Like, you've caused all this suffering, and you realize, like, oh, he had a bigger picture in mind. And I think it also forces us to break out of these very tight time frames and look at this, like, multi-generational approach towards change, which can be hard because it's hard to look beyond ourselves a lot. And this is how Jemisin herself kind of explains the world that she built and why it's important for her to be asking these questions. This is an interview in Oprah Daily. She says, in the Broken Earth books, we see the detritus of a utopian-ish society that depends on the oppression of a single group of people. And even when it doesn't have that single group of people to oppress, it literally creates its own underclass. There's a tendency in science fiction to suggest that our technology will save us, that if we just become eco-friendly enough, all of our problems will fall away. Even when our technology improves, if we haven't fixed that part of ourselves, the world will still be completely screwed up. I'm throwing the question out, what are you willing to do if you want a better way? I will continue to explore, and that may take the rest of my life.
Yeah.
This was something I really liked about the book, is the first time especially. It really was a big moment when I realized that this Silandra's society is our utopian future of 2023, right? It's, the buildings that are built of brick are like seen as like, oh my gosh, it's so like energy inefficient, and like it's so is this so safe and secure, where the whole world is built out of greenery and life, and there's not much dead civ ruins of this place because it's all like organic matter. I'm like, oh, how is it sustainable? And you realize it's built on like horrible oppression, and like these people too were still kind of like, how do we harness and exploit the power of the earth?
It's powered by the energy and the bodies of the people that they hated. Literally. Yeah, that's a horrible moment when you see them wrapped up in these sort of energy silos.
And it goes back to what you were saying earlier when we were talking about the different sides of this conflict. Like, we wanted there to be like the bad guy, the evil mastermind, but really what it is bad ideology. Like, ideology that exploits and oppress. Enough people got on board with it that you can't just point at one person and be like, they were the evil mastermind, Gallant was the wrong one all along. It's way more complicated than that, but also way more simpler than that.
Yeah, it's like we can fix all the things we want, we can progress all we want, but if we still have this underlying idea that we can look at something, and because it's different than us, we say it's not alive and it's not worthy of respect, like it's exploitable. So the thing that destroys the society is they look at this group of people who are just people. They're just a different culture. And they look at the earth itself and they say, this is just an exploitable thing. It is a thing. It is an object. We can take from it. We can use it. Because it's different, it is not worthy of being treated like a person. And that is their downfall. And that ideology is what the protagonist arguably is learning to correct. I think is what Hoa is trying to correct. Yeah, so we found a few sort of parallels. I feel like Jemisin isn't making like a one-to-one comparison of like, oh, this is just about race. Or this is, she's not saying like, oh, this is a direct allegory for race in America. You know what I mean? Like, she's big-brained energy, right? We're much bigger than that. But so she draws a lot of comparisons to different types of oppression that we see in the world. So there's elements of race and colorism. I mean, there's the way that they look physically different. That was something that made people nervous. And so there's a lot of judgment purely based on physical differences. And there's a hint of the one-drop rule that we saw in the US, where like, if you had just a tiny bit of African genes, that you were considered Black. And so there was this concept of passing. And you see that a bit in the way that Galat and Kalenli relate to each other. They both grew up together, and Galat has some very visible traces of the Nias people, but he was not genetically manipulated. He was allowed to be a person, just like a middle tier person, whereas Kalenli was, genetically modified to become the sort of image of their nightmares, right? She was genetically modified to become the thing that Silanna just thought the Nias people were, even though they weren't. And so these two grew up side by side. Kalenli was treated as not a person at all, and Galat was treated as like a less of a person, but still a person. And so he did not see the differences between them, and he doesn't see the messy combination of privilege and discrimination that he experiences, and so really isolates and kind of punishes Kalenli. He's unwilling to, all he does is reassure himself, like, he's not like the people who made her life harder. He's not one of them, because he's also been hurt by them. So it gets into kind of that messy power struggle. There's also elements of neurodiversity, particularly with the tuners. This is something we talked about in earlier episodes, so like a comparison of orogeny as kind of neurodiversity. The tuners in particular, and then the people who become stone eaters, they're designed to have no feelings. But of course they do have feelings, they are people, but they express their feelings very differently. They express it through the earth. And so there's this like complete misunderstanding and complexity of communication between the Silanagisd people and the tuners. The majority of Silanagists think that they don't have any feelings at all, and so think that that's an excuse to treat them as less than. That felt very sort of neurodiversity coded.
And as we kind of alluded to a little bit, one of the other major forms of oppression discussed in this novel is cultural genocide. So we have the Nis people that have been annihilated. They have been, some people still have some like characteristics or physical traits that may look Nis, but like the culture is wiped out, except for a few examples. So like one, there's like this piece of Nis art. Ho is so confused when he sees it because it's kind of like the obelisks, but it's like better, prettier, but it doesn't do anything. And it has this sense of like purposelessness that like is really confusing. And it's kind of like put on show at a museum of the Silangist people kind of just like pushed in a corner and like, why did they do this? It's ridiculous. And it's like misunderstanding of their culture, I guess. We lose a lot of the context around it because it's been pulled out of context. We get some really wonderful sentences in this where Jemisin is talking about the Silangis as conquerors and also their weakness. So she writes, "There are none so frightened or so strange in their fears as conquerors. They are terrified their victims will someday do back what has been done to them. They dread the day when they are revealed to be not superior, but simply lucky. And if the Nis were simply human, the world built on it and humanity would fall apart." It's like one of the places that Kalenli takes them when she's giving them like a field trip to see some of the world. And as a reader, it gives us insight to just how scared the Silangist people and powerful they were that they could just wipe out this other culture.
I thought it was really powerful how, like, Silangist culture was, like, obsessed with the Nias culture. Because they had created them into, like, more than human and also less. Into these kind of mythical creatures in their mind because of the kind of art that they see in the museum, where it's this myth that they are better, that their Sesapine are stronger, that they're better at magic, that they're, but it's just they're emotionally attuned to the earth and see it as a person in a way that the Silangist culture does not. And so they try to turn the Nias way of making things into a machine. They try to scientificize it, whatever, scientify it. And it doesn't work. They're so obsessed with this culture that they have to consume it, that it can't be allowed to exist because it's so fundamentally different from their own, and it kind of terrifies them, and they create it into this myth. And that's applicable to a lot of oppressive systems. And she just articulates it so expertly in a way that can apply to so many different, like, I'm sure you could do an analysis from so many different angles of like how she articulates certain types of oppression that are so skillfully done. She set up this 40,000-year-old heritage of oppression. So how do we get out of that? What do we do?
I think another thing that makes this book so great as like the ending of this trilogy is that there is this hopefulness for the future that feels realistic within the context of this world, challenging yet a satisfying conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, the main answer is it's going to take generations to get there. And I think that's why, coming full circle, realizing Hoa is telling this story to the, infant stone eater Esun to remember who she is and where she came from. You have hope for the future because you know how long they can survive. And we've seen how Hoa has interjected in small ways in humanity to kind of save the people of Kostrima, provide for them, take care of people, and that there's little ways that the Stone Eaters can nudge the humans towards survival as well as doing the world a different way. The Yika and the Kostrima model is new and nascent, and maybe it's not going to work out, but maybe the Stone Eaters can come and support in the ways they can to, in generations' time, build a different world. And they, have a chance to kind of start over in a lot of ways. But it is also difficult to wrap your brain around, too, because you want to see Nasun have, like, a happy ending. But her life's going to be really hard. The Earth is going to take a while to, like, settle down.
Because she might not even survive the season.
The season may not be over in her lifetime. And it's going to take generations to make that kind of change after so long of oppression and fear being the ones in power.
The Kostrima as a model for the future was kind of a realization that I had. Because I got really frustrated with, like, why are we still here? I kept waiting for the story to move beyond Kostrima. I thought it was a bit dragging, especially in book 2. I thought it was like a character development thing in book 2 where, you know, the hero gets stuck somewhere and they have to, like, grow and learn something, and then they move on to their real quest in the final book. And finally, it clicked for me about halfway through when they're going through the stone forest, and you're watching them with the Renanis captives, and then also the Calmless origins that they pick up. And I finally saw what Jemisin was doing. Was she was trying to show us kind of how a new society could be constructed, piece by piece by piece. And it takes generations, right? It starts with Ika, who was tolerated. She was not celebrated for her gifts. Most people didn't like that she was an origin, but they knew she was an origin and they didn't kill her. And they gave her the chance to practice enough for her to be useful to her calm. Really kind of baseline, very, very minimal personhood. And then she, in turn, sets up a community where people have to practice that, and that everyone has a chance to prove that they can learn and change. So I feel like what she's setting up is like, it's a start. You know what I mean? It's a starting point where you have to be able to learn from your mistakes, even if you were the oppressor. You have to be given that chance. But the people in charge need to be the ones who have been formally oppressed.
Yeah, I think Danelle as a character is super fascinating. She's the one that was like the Renanis army and literally like sicked a guardian on Essen at one point, right? Like, but Ika's kind of extreme approach towards a new way of life meant that Danelle was not just killed out of like retribution, like out of revenge for what happened, but identified, if we're going to survive this season, we need the strongest people that we can get. And if they're willing to be a part of it and play by our rules and like commit to our community's values, sure, they can be a part of it. Like, we're not going to hold it against you. And I think that's like such a big pivotal shift in how this like people in this world operate.
Yeah.
Because we have seen, even if we didn't see it explicitly, have known it's happened where, you know, a comm is attacked, they decimate the others, they take all the supplies, they get attacked, they get decimated, the other comm, you know, it's just kind of like kill or be killed. And this is like a radical new way of living. And what it does then is we learn that Danelle was actually trained to be a lorist and is able to preserve the story of Esun and Nasun in the lorist tradition. One thing I also appreciated, and this kind of leads into the last thing we wanted to talk about, is this isn't a kind of like pushover, like kumbaya, let's all have peace kind of approach, right?
Yeah.
Hoa's parting words to the next generation, to Nasun, who survived this encounter, she says they're not going to choose something different. She doesn't see a world that's going to choose something different than what they already have. And Hoa says they will if you make them. He's not saying go be friends with everyone, get everyone on your side, like have a democracy. Like it's like there's still this line of like, there is a better way, we can make it happen even if it takes force. You know, yeah. Ika she did not back down from killing people who were against the comm.
Yeah.
She would open the door and you had one chance. Maybe you had one chance. And that was the opportunity that a lot of people took and joined Kostrima. Ika wasn't about to let, you know, their comm be destroyed over the sake of feel good. And in the same way that Hoa is saying, it's going to take effort. It's going to be a challenge to change people's minds. Like, I think I knew Essen wasn't going to make it through. I was a little sad. I wanted to have a more mother-daughter ride off into the sunset, build a better world together. Unfortunately, we don't get that. But I do, like, appreciate the hopeful note at the end. These people at least will live to see another day. And there's a chance that the world can be different. It just may take a long time to get there.
It's about choices and stories, right? If you think about the people who are left, who witnessed that moment. Someone who understands all the pain of the world. You have Nasun, right? Where she's like suffered so much. needs to sort of force the world to see a new way. You have a lorist there. That seems to be very important. You have a very open-minded and enthusiastic scientist who's like, we're going to figure this shit out. We're going to learn how to live with the moon again. And her very supportive girlfriend who's just along for the ride. And then the Stone Eaters who are going to be like supporting them along the way, making sure that Castrima survives, I think.
Well, we've come to the end of this trilogy. What would you recommend people read next?
I would say the Earthsea fantasy series by Ursula K. Le Guin. It's more anthropological than psychological, but I would say a similar level of like intellectual. And it's also one of the earliest fantasy series with any kind of dark-skinned protagonists. You know, it was a baby step at the time in the 60s.
I recently finished reading Babel by R.F. Kuang.
Yes.
Julie and I are already writing notes for that episode. Oh, yeah. And that's a really great one. I mean, some similarities as far as like people who think they are the gods and can create anything they want. There's some magic, it's history, but it's also super different. It's really different than the trilogy. It's also only one book. And if you're like, Babel even seems long after I've made it through these 3 very long novels of the Broken Earth trilogy, a short, delightful, heart-wrenching, all the feels, fantasy, sci-fi-ish book I would recommend is This Is How You Lose the Time War by Max Gladstone and Amal El-Mortar. We read a quote from her earlier. So yeah, those are like in the same vibes, I would say, as The Broken Earth, but different directions. And finally, closing out, what are you currently obsessed with? What are you reading about, listening to, watching these days?
Well, I was in New York on my spring break visiting some friends, and it was absolutely delightful. And we watched Interview with the Vampire together, the series, the AMC series. I had never finished it. I think I've recommended it on here before, and I am obsessed with it, but I never finished it. So I finally finished it with them. And I highly recommend you watch it with someone because it can be a bit intense, but oh my god, it's so good. So messy, so camp, so incredible. We mentioned that we're reading Babel. I read that on the plane to and from New York, and wow. I can't wait to talk about it. It's coming next. And then today, this dates when we're recording this, August D's new album, D-Day, dropped. There's a music video called Hegum that is pure cinema. It's so good. It's so good. I might make Victoria go watch it right now. I don't know. The album's amazing. It takes you on a whole emotional journey. I'm so excited to see him in concert. It's going to be great. So yeah, how about you?
In between reading Babel and rereading The Stone Sky, I took a little refresher. And I read I Kiss Shar Wheeler by Casey McQuiston. Casey McQuiston's also the author of Red, White, and Royal Blue, which we talked about on this podcast. So I think, and I Kiss Shar Wheeler is a little younger, so a little more like YA audience. It's about teenagers going to a Christian high school, and I'm just like, I feel so seen. It was so good. I texted Julie. I was like, oh my gosh. Oh, it was cute. Next in Fashion Season 2 is what I've been watching. Tan France is back. It's a delight. He has a new co-host that I'm forgetting her name. Famous supermodel.
Is it Gigi this time?
Yes, Gigi Hadid. I didn't know Next in Fashion was getting renewed because when the first season came out in 2020, they didn't get renewal. And so it was like a bright spot in my day when I realized that a new season had come out because I don't follow things like that. And so I saw someone post about it on Instagram and I was like, wait a second, what? So I got partway through that before I went on my vacation. So I have another half to finish when I come back. 2 delightful things that are completely not related to this episode, but...
Yeah, mine are all super angsty and yours are all like bright and refreshing.
Well, thanks for joining us all.
Thanks for coming on this journey with us.
Until next time, happy reading.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Book Club with Julia and Victoria. We would love to hear your thoughts on this book or the topic we discussed, so you can share your review and recommendations with us on Instagram at Book Club with JV, on our website, bookclubwithjv.com, or by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. You can also visit our website for show notes with links to all of the recommendations and the things bringing us joy. If you don't already, go ahead and follow us on whichever podcast platform you are listening on so that you can be notified when our next episode is released. This episode was co-hosted and produced by myself, Victoria Bruick, along with Julia Clausen. Rebecca Gasme provides us with project management support. Our music is composed by Greg Bruick, and our logo was designed by Gabby Fabland. Until next time, happy reading.